Chapter 5. The next 3 years passed much more rapidly. Time whirled away like smoke with Olav. He had settled down. This was a life that Olav Audunsson had never before experienced. In his heart, he felt its quietude as emptiness or as a loss. But if he had been asked what he thought of his life now, he must have answered that he was well content. His affairs prospered in these years, and he bought some shares in farms in the neighbouring parishes. Olav never changed in this respect, that he put more faith in the land than in the sea. And he had better luck with his farming than ever before. When he first came to Hestviken, full of zest and courage, he lacked experience, and since then he had always been tied. Nevertheless, it must be said that there had always been prosperity at Hestviken. But now, under Marta Birgersdatter's control, it was more noticeable. There was no longer any trouble with the serving folk. The old ones stayed on. The foreman, old Tor, went about his work quiet and cool-headed. Svein the herdsman, John and Bodvar, the housecarls, remained unmarried, all three. Ragnar lived in Torhild's house with her children and was dairywoman. Asta had put aside all wantonness and still enjoyed her honour and good name. Besides these, there was a young lad and a half-grown maid. They went somewhat short of merriment and jollity at the manor, but these folk lived well. The mistress was just and fairly open-handed. Pauper couples, who were maintained in the homesteads of the parish, were glad when their turn came to Hestviken. The master of the house said little, and there was no denying he depressed the folk around him. But this was only until they got to know him, his servant said. One grew accustomed to him. Olaf was not badly liked by his household. He left Lady Marta a free hand, and was glad to take her advice in those matters which came under himself. The footing between them was almost as if she had been his mother, a very masterful mother, and he a compliant son. Even at the hovel, Rundmere, things were quiet. Marta Birgersdatter had reduced Arnketel and Liv to order. He had become rather hunchbacked, wrinkled and dried up. She was ever yeasty and exuberant. A child appeared in the cot every year towards spring. Some trifles were always missed, food, wool, or tow, when Liv had been about at Hestviken. But it had become a sort of right that she might take without asking leave, so long as she kept within bounds. Elsewhere she never pilfered now, except from Una at Ringel. Arnketel had given up stealing since Marta surprised him one evening. He was in one of the storehouses, struggling to strike a light. "No need for a light here, Anki. I think you know the way." The two little maids were growing. Their beauty was noised abroad. They were now old enough to be present at feasts and gatherings, which were but few, for Olaf held intercourse with none but the circle of nearest neighbours, who visited each other year after year. But the people of the parish saw the Hestvik maids at church. Olav Audunsson rode up first, and Botild Askersdatter sat behind on his horse with her arms around his waist, for Cecilia rode with old Tor. This was his right, and if they took that from him, he would not stay at the manor another day, he threatened jokingly. The two children were always richly and handsomely dressed when they came to Mass. Lady Marta gave them kirtles of dyed cloth, with gaily embroidered edges, and she bound their flowing hair with silken ribbons worked with gold. In everyday life Olaf did not see much of his daughters. He had built a women's house by the side of the old hearth-room house. Marta thought that the women ought to have a house of their own, where they could work with their looms, their sewing, and the like. Cecilia and Botild must now learn to use their hands. The new house was a fine one. Bodvar was a skilful woodcarver, and he decorated it with much handsome ornament. It was not every month that Olaf set foot inside the door of it. But although he saw so little of the children, a pale wintry sunshine fell upon his spirit from the two fair young lives that were growing up so near to his own frozen life. It looked as if Lady Marta had succeeded in taming Cecilia's hot temper, or she had grown out of it as she got more sense. Headstrong she was still, but she had acquired a calmer, rather sulky way. The housefolk laughed when the child gave a short, sharp answer. She was so like her father, they said. But they thought it became her well. She was so fair to look upon that, whatever she said or did, folk thought it suited her. She liked Lady Marta, that was easily seen, though Cecilia gave little sign of it in words or loving behaviour. In the same way she showed her affection for old Tor, for Ragnar and her children, a tacit, steady loyalty through thick and thin. Only toward her foster sister Botild did she show a different, gentler and softer way. So far as could be judged by the manner of this calm, reticent little girl, she loved Botild better than anyone in the world. But all at Hestviken took pains to be gentle and kind to Botild. She still seemed a little forlorn. There was something about her which seemed to ask them to deal tenderly and cautiously with her. Even Olaf showed his fondness for his foster-daughter more than his affection for his own daughter. If some chance prompting led him to fondle the children, it was Botild whose hair he stroked or whose cheek he patted, as though it came easier with her, as she brightened up with joy at the slightest caress. If the children came down to the waterside to meet him, or accompanied him out into the fields, it was Botild he took by the hand and led, for he saw she liked it. She looked up at him at every word they exchanged, and her blue eyes were so demure beneath her thick auburn hair. Cecilia's bright, pale eyes looked the world straight in the face, wide awake. There was an air about her whole compact little figure which said she could quite well walk alone. She was his own child. Olaf bore his love for his daughter within him as a safely locked treasure which he had no need to look to. His kindness for his foster-daughter he could much more easily pay out in small coin as occasion arose. There was not a thing about Cecilia Olafsdatter to recall her mother. The last shadow of a memory of Ingunn Steinfinnsdatter's vain and hapless life seemed to have vanished from her home. Sira Halbjorn remarked this one day, when he had come to ask for a passage in Olaf's boat. "I wonder if there is anyone in the countryside who remembers your wife but you." He caught sight of Olaf's face as soon as he had said it. Instinctively he turned his own away, as when he was hearing a confession. "But you remember her," said Olaf after a pause, almost inaudibly. "You know, it is not many days since I last said a mass for her. It came into my mind just now. I remember all the years I saw her lying in the bed there. I had thought to see you, though, at the Mass for the dead," said the priest. "I had forgot it was that day, until the evening." "No," Olaf added after a moment. "There cannot be many who remember her now." One evening early in the spring, some men had come into the house at Hestviken. They were folk from within the parish who had their hard on Olaf's shore. They had come by water from a feast higher up the fjord, and the drink was still in them. Olaf and old Tor were sitting together, mending some gear. The other men had not yet come in, and the women were in the outhouses. Only the little girls were playing on the bench. Then Olav sent Tor to fetch ale for the guests, and for a while the talk went peaceably, about the wedding and such matters. In the course of it, one of the men said to Olav, "That Torhild you had a child by when she was here. She was at the feast too. She bade us bring greetings to Hestviken." Olav thanked them and asked how things were with her. "Well," said the men, "she enjoyed great respect in the neighbourhood, and she was prospering. She had done so well with Alkan that folk now called the place Torhild Root." Old Tor asked eagerly for more news of Torhild Bjornsdatter. He had always liked her so well. Then they talked for a time of her way of keeping house. Olav listened, but took no part in the conversation, except to ask, "Had she the boy with her at the feast?" The men said yes. He was a handsome boy, fair and strong. No need to ask who is his father. But as the men stirred up the remnant of drink that was in them, they grew first fuddled, and soon after 2 of them began to quarrel and threaten each other. At last Olav had to ask them to keep the peace or go out. At that moment the 2 men came to grips. The little girls jumped onto Olav's clothes chest and stood there. Then one of the men caught sight of them, turned that way, and tried to make game of them. Olav got up, upsetting all he had on his lap onto the floor. He was going to part the 2 who were fighting. At the same moment the 3rd man caught hold of the girls. Olav saw Botild shrink away with a little helpless whine of terror. Something flashed in Cecilia's hand. The child had drawn her little knife and struck at the man. Olav took him by the shoulders, put his knee to the small of his back, and forced him to the floor. Tor now came to his master's aid and opened the door. Olav took the stranger by the shoulders and middle and heaved him out through the anteroom into the yard. Then he ran back to deal with the others. With many a crash against walls and doorposts, with roars and oaths, but no very hard struggle, Olav and Tor got the room cleared of the strangers and the door bolted. They raged and bellowed out in the yard, kicked at the front door and banged on the walls. Olav and Tor listened, laughing and panting, as they put their clothes straight. They too had got some knocks, either from the drunken men's fists or heels, or from striking against the walls of the dark anteroom. Smiling, Olav turned to the children. Cecilia's round, milk-white face was still contorted with fury. There was a pale green flash in her eyes. But Botild was clinging to the wall, trembling so that her teeth chattered. When Olav touched her, she burst into a fit of weeping so terrible that her foster-father was quite alarmed. He drew her towards him, had to sit down and hold her in his arms while he tried to comfort her like a little child. Though she was no longer a little girl, he felt, she was growing up now, thin and long of limb. 12 winters she must be. He stroked her head with its long plaits, telling her not to be afraid, though he knew of old it was of little use. She was always taken thus when folk came to blows, and she was by, even though no one thought of doing anything to her. Whenever the bawling and battering outside grew louder, a twitching went through the girl's delicate frame. Then Olav gently pushed her away, got up, and went out. At the same moment the housecarls entered the yard, and the strangers took flight. Later, as they sat at table, and Cecilia was about to cut herself a slice of cheese, one of the housecarls cried with a laugh, "Your knife is bloody, Cecilia." Botild set up a screech, but now Olav and the men could not help laughing at her timidity. They were enlivened by the little tussle earlier in the evening, and now they sat at their ease over the table with good ale and food and a brisk fire on the hearth. Cecilia spat on her knife and wiped it on the inside of her kirtle. Then she cut herself a good piece of cheese and laid it between 2 slices of bread. Not a word did she utter. Olaf laughed. "May I see that knife of yours? It was a feeble defence, that, my daughter." "Then give me a better knife, father," said the maid. "That I will," replied her father, gaily as before. After supper, Olaf fetched in the little iron-bound coffer in which he kept his treasures. The girls hung over his shoulders as he searched in it. Not many times had the children been allowed to see what their father kept therein. They uttered a cry and asked a question as each thing was brought to light, and Olaf, who was in a good humour this evening, let them handle the jewels and try them on. At the bottom lay 4 handsome daggers. Olaf never wore them. Cecilia snatched the longest. "Will you give me this one, father?" She drew it out of its sheath. It was a foreign weapon with a 3-cornered blade, the handle and sheath finely ornamented with gilt rings. Olaf took it from her and looked at it a moment. "That is no woman's knife, Cecilia. It is only fit to strike down a foe. You will find this one more useful." He handed her a big Norwegian knife with a broad, strong blade and a handle of carved walrus tusk. "I would rather have the other," said the maid. Olaf considered a moment. "Well, it is not often you ask anything of me, so take it then." He took up her thick flaxen plait. It lay in coils, so curly was Cecilia's hair. "You should not have been the daughter of this house, Cecilia, that is sure." Olaf heard tidings of Eirik once in a while, and as he grew accustomed to the boy's absence, the thought sometimes came to him, perhaps Eirik would never come home. And it might happen that he thought that were best. He must surely receive something in return for having sold his soul. If the fraud were wiped out so that his race and his heritage were not falsified, then it seemed to him it would be somewhat easier to face death and judgment. His own life he had thrown away by his own fault. He thought of it with a strange, clear composure. It almost gave him a kind of chilly joy to recognize that the injustice was his and God was just. He had never been able to understand how any man could find consolation in blaming or cursing God. And he himself was only one man. His fate could be no such great matter. He felt it a good thing to know that the world was safe in the hands of the gentle Christ, however many men might rise in revolt. Cecilia's happiness, that he believed in firmly. The same year, about midsummer, Bard of Skikjostad and Sigrid Undset married off their eldest daughter. The bridegroom lived in the neighbouring parish, and Olav Audunsson was one of those who brought the bride home to his house, for he was her godfather. A good godfather he had not been. He had paid little heed to the maiden. Her name was Helga. She was of plain and modest appearance, and had little to say for herself by all accounts. But on her wedding day she was fair to look upon. At first Bard had refused to hear of this marriage. He had had many matters in dispute with the bridegroom, who was much older than Helga. But at the mid-Lent thing this year an atonement had been made between the men, and so Bard betrothed his daughter to Hoskol Johnson. Olaf was strangely moved at the sight of the young bride. Helga Bardsdatter was so changed that she seemed to have taken on a new semblance. Others of the wedding guests had felt the same, he found. They spoke of it as they sat together on the evening of the 3rd day of the feast in a little house apart, where quarters had been assigned to the older and more esteemed guests who attended the wedding. Olaf had been placed high up, next after Thorgrim of Ringel, the husband of the bride's aunt. Facing him sat Sira Halbjorn in the highest seat. From Hoskold and Helga the talk shifted to other women who had been notably fair and merry brides, or good and staunch housewives. The old men always thought that none of those now living could bear to be set beside the women they remembered in their youth. Sira Halbjorn leaned over the table, drawing lines with the spilt ale. He had been out of humour all through the wedding, tired and taciturn. This talk seemed to weary him. "Do you mean to sit here all night prating of these dead women? While they lived, their husbands were as sick of them as are most men, I'll warrant. I think that fair companion of Olav Audunsson's is better worth possessing than all the rest together." He laughed weakly, being somewhat gone in drink. "Tell me, friend Olaf, will you sell me that fair mistress of yours?" Olaf straightened himself abruptly, red and angry. He could not guess what the priest was aiming at. Thorgrim of Ringel did not see it either. He asked, "What do you mean, Sira?" Sira Halbjorn laughed as before, stretched behind Thorgrim's back, and passed his hand over the blade of Olaf's axe, which hung behind his seat. "This is what I mean." He let his hand fall on Olaf's shoulder. Olaf shook it off with a laugh of displeasure. "No, priest, lately you would have my falcon, and this axe is not—" The axe kinfetch rang. Everyone present heard it. Its deep notes sang out through the room and slowly died away. Sira Halbjorn leapt up and seized the axe. "Is she one of those that sing, your axe, Olaf?" he asked excitedly. "So 'tis said, but I thought she had lost her voice long ago, from old age." He took the axe from the priest and hung it back on the wall. The men fell into a discussion whether the axe had sung of itself, or whether it was owing to Sira Halbjorn touching it. Olaf and the priest had looked each other in the eyes an instant. Then they both laughed, alike uncheerful. It was as though they had discovered a bond between them, that the heart of neither was in this merriment. Olaf took his leave of the bridal gathering the same evening, but told his men they might stay till the next day and escort Marta Burgersdatter and the children home. The sky was covered high up by a thin veil of cloud. Under the colourless vault of the summer night, the farms loomed grey with uncut meadows and strips of pale green corn, as Olaf rode along the path which ran through the belt of copse skirting the home fields. The world was asleep, but for the harsh note of the corncrake somewhere in the meadow. He reached the hamlet by the church, and the horse moved more freely, eager for home. The church stood on a little height, with its stone walls shining faintly, and its shingle roof rising above the little window slits. Olaf turned his horse into the track that led to the church green. The stillness of the night seemed to press upon him like a living thing, as the sound of the horse's hoofs were deadened in the rough grass. By the churchyard wall lay some ancient burial mounds. The largest came right up to the fence, so that the old ash trees that surmounted it cast their shade beyond it. Olaf dismounted and tied his horse to a rail near the gate of the churchyard. He must have no steel on him, he remembered. He took off his belt and laid it on the ground together with his axe. Then he went forward to the biggest of the mounds. The very sound of dry twigs breaking under his footsteps, there was a thick carpet of them under the ashes, gave him a chill feeling that raised the hair on his head. He walked over the mound, down to the churchyard wall, and mounted it. Within, the gravestones lay sunken in the summer growth of grass which reached to the wall of the church. Olaf gazed till black specks seemed to float before his eyes, and his heart beat so that he had a taste of blood in his mouth. But the feeling of dizziness was only as though the world swam round him. Within himself there was calm, an undisturbed core. Nevertheless, he involuntarily closed his eyes at the sound of his own voice as he called clearly and firmly, "Ingunn, Steinfinnsons, arise!" His horse out on the green gave a start, he could hear. He dared not turn and look that way. His eyes were fixed on the church wall, where he descried the gravestone close by the women's door. Cold and stiff in the cheeks with pallor, he called again, "Ingunn, Steinfinnsons, arise! Ingunn, Steinfinnsons, arise!" Again he had closed his eyes, but he saw it, the grey stone slowly lifting, the white figure of the dead rising up and shaking the mould from her grave clothes. He bent his head back, drew breath, and opened his eyes. There was nothing to be seen but the grey, mild night. Olaf stared, as though this was more incredible than anything else. But the churchyard lay there asleep, with the sunken stones half hidden by the long grass, right up to the grey wall of the church. At last he turned, walked back across the mound, down to his horse. As he untied the reins, he saw that the dun noticed something. He was standing with his head raised, nostrils distended, laid back his ears, and started twice as he lay his hand upon him. But Olaf could see nothing. Then he got into the saddle and gave the horse his head. The swift pace did him good. The pressure of the air and the thud overcame the sinister silence. It was morning when he reached Hestviken. The clouds were tinged with pink. When Olaf had stabled his horse, he went out onto the rock to look at the weather, from habit. A little breeze before sunrise darkened the water of the fjord. The living room was empty and deserted. Olaf went into the closet and flung himself upon the bed without undressing. But as soon as he had closed his eyes, he started up, wide awake. He stared at the grey opening into the larger room, but there was no one. Thoughts rose in him like bitter waters. She had once promised, "If the dead may visit the living." But now she was infinitely farther from him than before. The first year, nay, the first summer after her death, he had felt how near she was, in the darkness that concealed them from one another. Now they had come so far asunder that she no longer heard him when he called. As he lay, the solitude about him turned little by little to a kind of vision. He was up on a bare and rocky mountain top, where some heather grew and the rocks were grey with lichen. Behind him on every side lay forest, grey with rime, and in the hollows were pale bogs with frozen waterholes. But far away the grey, closed sky was merged in low, dark blue ridges. He tried to send a cry out yonder, but knew it was useless. The vision faded slowly into a dreamless gloom of sleep, and he did not wake until Ragnar came in at breakfast time. She had wondered greatly, she said, when she heard from Svein that his horse stood in the stable but not the others.